Welcome, everyone. I'm Amanda Nicholson, Chief Operating Officer here at the Product Stewardship Institute. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Transforming Challenges into Opportunities, Technology Solutions for PROs and Other Recycling and Stewardship Organizations. Next slide. For those not familiar with the Product Stewardship Institute, we are a national nonprofit committed to reducing the health, safety, and environmental impacts of consumer products across their life cycle, with a strong focus on sustainable end-of-life management. We have 47 state agency members, hundreds of local government members, and over 120 partners from companies, organizations, academic institutions, and non-US governments. Next slide. We know from our extensive work in the EPR field that producer responsibility organizations, or PROs, and similar stewardship organizations faced a host of challenges in meeting their responsibilities, whether it's unexpectedly coming up short on a recovery goal, paper trail headaches like verification and tracking issues, or just being able to pull up the data you need when you need it to demonstrate to regulators and to the public that your program is succeeding and achieving its goals. We know that managing data more efficiently and effectively will save PROs and in turn producers and consumers money, and will provide all stakeholders with the assurance that stewardship programs are transparent and accountable, reliable, and well managed. In today's webinar, our expert speakers will delve into the software implementation experience of one PRO, offer the perspective of a government official who works with PROs during EPR law implementation, and explore a technology solution offered by Diversys. Our speakers include Maury Schneer, founder and president of Mobius PRO Services, Mobius Pro, Blake Bennett, Operations and Policy Analyst at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and Mark Jemensky, Chief Product Officer at Diversys, who will have some exciting software previews to share with us. I will be your moderator today. During the presentations, I'll compile your questions as they come in, and I'll ask them of our speakers during the Q&A portion of the call. I encourage you to send in your questions as soon as you have them, no need to wait. On that note, I'd like to review a few logistical items to help everyone participate in today's webinar. First, you have the option of joining via phone or computer audio. To select your audio option, click Audio Settings in the lower left corner of your screen, and from there you can select your audio input or switch between audio if you have multiple devices connected to your computer. You can also change your webinar view. As you see here, just click View Options on the top of your screen to exit or enter full screen mode. To ask questions, whether they're questions about the Zoom platform or questions about the content of our speakers' presentations, click on the Q&A icon located at the bottom center of your screen and type your question into the field that reads, "Type your question here." Then click Send. Logistical questions will be answered in the Q&A box, and content questions will be asked aloud during the Q&A period in the second half of today's webinar. Do not use the chat to submit questions. We won't be monitoring the chat for the purposes of Q&A. All of PSI's webinars and web symposiums are recorded, so you can catch anything you missed. The recording of today's webinar, as well as the slides, will be posted on our website within 24 hours. To access the recording, visit productstewardship.us, click on Events, and then on On-Demand Webinars, as you see here on the screen. I'd like to pause now before we hear from our panelists to do a quick poll. I'm wondering what type of organization you are here on the webinar today. And we see a whole bunch of folks responding. Thanks so much for letting us know what stakeholder group you're representing today. Looks like we have got about 67 responses to be slowed. Excellent. So we have about a third, 37% actually, of the folks on the call are with government organizations. We have another 28% who are either with a producer responsibility organization or represent a producer or a manufacturer. And then we have another 10% representing recycling companies and environmental nonprofit organizations. And then about 20% of you are an other type of organization. So maybe we need to create some more categories in the future. Thanks very much, everybody. All right, Jess, shall we move on? Great. So I would like now to introduce you to our first speaker, Maurice Schneer, the founder and president of Mobius Pro Services. Mobius manages EPR programs for tires, electronics, and hazardous and special products like antifreeze in Canada. Maury, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. I'm pleased to be able to share our observations and experience in our journey towards being able to implement a software solution that works to meet our mandate to look after our producers' responsibilities. Next slide, please. First, to give you a little context of where we're operating and some of the history that got us to this point, just to cover quickly, we're operating currently for the most part in Ontario. There may also be some participants here from Canada and Ontario, so forgive me if I'm going over something obvious, but for those of you who may not be super familiar, Ontario has a population roughly about 15 million people. I am and Mobius operates out of Toronto. Interesting fact, Toronto is the 4th largest metropolitan area in North America, and Toronto proper has about 2.7 million people in it, and the Greater Toronto area is about 7 million people. Speaking to the point about Ontario's regulatory environment, we've moved here from a EPR framework to something that is a more individual producer responsibility framework, and it's been an interesting transition since the underlying legislation changed about 4 years ago. Before, we had a regulation called the Waste Diversion Act, and in that act, it set up several different agencies that oversaw collecting of funds from stewards or producers and dispersing it to service providers who got the process of collection and recovery happening and actually made things happen there. So I'm oversimplifying a little bit, and there's a few wrinkles in here that make it a little different than this, but this is substantially what the situation was up to January 1st, 2019, when the first transition of the tire program changed. And then about a year or so after that, the electronics program transitioned. The hazardous special waste program has transitioned effective just a few weeks ago. And the big enchilada is transitioning in a number of years, about a year and a half or two, starting in the Blue Box program, which is a program whose size eclipses probably most of the other ones. In the new world, the regulations actually don't even use the word waste. It's all about resource recovery, and that top box there is actually signifying the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. And in this framework, the government really just issues regulations, and it's a very results-based requirement, and industry has a number of different competitive choices in each of these regulatory environments as to who and how they meet their regulatory requirements. So in the case of tires, there's actually 6 producer responsibility organizations that have some combination of market share in that environment. In electronics, there's 12. Currently in the hazardous and special products environment, there's 4 PROs that have been registered, and the Blue Box program, since the transition has yet to quite start, it's to be determined how many different PROs will happen in that environment. Next slide, please. So the first question as to why Mobius found itself in a situation where we needed to implement a platform to help us manage our collection and recovery activities. The first thing is precisely because of what I just talked about previously. Ontario moved from an extended producer responsibility framework where there was pretty much one single agency in each of those materials to an IPR framework where it was much more results oriented, and any number of competitive entities can meet the obligations of producers, or producers may even find a way to do it themselves. And that's perfectly allowable and in fact, to some degree expected within the regulatory framework. In these regulations, the past supply of any material is what determines the current individual obligation that a producer has. So the more you sold in the past, the more current obligation you have in the present. And these obligations are spelled out in simple terms, in terms of how much tons a producer has to ensure has been collected or collected on their behalf. And further, there are requirements to achieve minimum recovery targets for everything that is collected and a time frame to achieve that recovery process. So you can't just collect it and let it sit around for a year and wonder what to do with it. There are timelines that you have to hit to make sure that you are achieving the recovery rates from the collection targets, and the collection targets are pass fail. You have to hit them or else. So producers, simply put, their job is to supply material, and in this market, the pros that exist, their job is to collect it, recover it, and most importantly, prove it. And that's where Diversys and our implementation of it make it happen. So with producers having multiple pros to look after the regulatory options, it's important to be mindful that if a PRO fails to achieve the compliance that is required under the regulations, the actual liability is not subcontracted. The liability still falls to the producers. So from the PRO's standpoint, if you fall short of your collection targets on behalf of your producers, that's a fail. And if you find out too little, too late, for example, you find out in October of a year that you're not going to achieve the collection and recovery targets on behalf of your producers, that too is a fail. And that speaks to the point as to why we need a system that allows us to manage and gives us virtually real-time indications of our trajectory throughout the course of the year. So that all adds up to, what I sort of speak to is that from our customers who are producers, from their standpoint, they're looking for no surprises from their PRO. Next slide, please. So now that we established why we needed a system, the next question is, why did we choose Diversys? Well, first off, I'll admit that I am a bit of a database application geek, and I was always going to be using a system of some sort to make sure that we had data capture happening on site and that we had the ability to accumulate that information and measure results in real time. And I will admit that I also considered developing an application of our own to accomplish this, but really there was not much need for us to do that because Diversys out of the gate accomplishes much of our must-have requirements. The first thing we needed to have is a mobile device front end for fast and easy in-field service providers to register when they've achieved the act of collection on site. And we have got that implemented now, and it's worth noting that since we've implemented, the number of devices that this will work on has been increased, so it's not just a tablet-based system. We're able to bring users on using either iOS or Android devices. And generally, it doesn't take that long, 20 to 30 seconds for each technician to enter a transaction, provided it's a fairly straightforward one, and even complicated ones don't take a lot of time. Important to know behind the scenes that the records that are being captured include the GPS location of the user at the time so that you can reconcile the location that device was actually recording the transaction against the stated address of where that collection site exists. It also gives us the ability, and one of the things we needed was a meta level, what I call meta level service provider management. We need to be able to take a step back and look at the big picture across all of the service providers that we work with to see which hauler or which processor or retreader in the case of tires are hitting their numbers and making sure that we hit our target throughout the course of the year. Like I said before, finding out too little too late is a fail. And because Mobius has always had the intention of being a multi-material PRO, we needed a software system that would work in multi-materials, and that is one of the opportunities that Diversys presents to us. And then most importantly too was we needed a rapport between us and the software company that was going to be a two-way sort of rapport that there was going to be dialogue as to how the system was or was not working properly and how it needed to be, shaped to match the actual process flow on the ground. And I'm pleased to say that over the last year or so that we've been working with Diversys, it's a very much a two-way conduit of communication, where they often reach out to us in their product development to just ensure that what they're building matches the real world requirements. We also were looking for continual evolution. We didn't want a software system that was going to be static or only periodically updated. And frankly, one of the other reasons we chose Diversys is that, as far as we can see, there is no other credible choice in this niche of an application that's required. Next slide, please. So this slide really encompasses a mouthful, because bringing up a Diversys application is, it's requires thought and effort to make sure that you set it up right at the first instance, because those processes and those decisions will be part of the process flow going forward. But at a high level, it's really just a three-step process where the collectors are set up, haulers are set up, and processors are set up. You have to go through a process of defining what fields and types of information are required of each of those participants, and be conscious that each one of those participants may have multiple roles. And this happens a lot in the industries that we've worked in so far, where, for example, processors who take in material and turn it into some sort of recycled output also have their own trucking fleet. And because of the way the regulations are worded in this jurisdiction, we need to be conscious that the act of collection and hauling is something that needs to be measured separately from the act of processing and conversion. And in that context, we have set up haulers who are subsets of the processor, but they really have to log in separately to record separate activities to achieve each of those separate important requirements of the regulations. Then rates for compensation of service providers have to be established, and there's lots of different wrinkles in how haulers get paid or how processors get paid. And that's kind of a good news, bad news equation, because the good news is, so far, Diversys seems to have the ability to turn the dials and match any payment arrangements that we found with participants and haulers or processors. Bad news is sometimes you have to get into the weeds to make sure that you're illuminating all these different wrinkles and arrangements that you may have. So there is some heavy lifting that's required in that area out of the gate, but once it's input and mirrors your actual practices in the field, you don't really have to revisit that a lot. There's lots of different ways to articulate the rates that are paid to the participants. And once you've exhausted all those, you're pretty much done. And then from there, you get into the cycle of the business, where participants are processing month-end claims after the close of the month, and they submit them to the PRO for review and payment. And that cycle just continues itself with an opportunity to have management by exception and other sorts of metrics to ensure that everything that has been submitted actually aligns with what needs to happen. Next slide, please. So the end result is that the concept of data being turned into information that's useful has been accomplished, and it gives management of the PRO tools to create a system for exception management, performance management. All important to any PRO's operations is the ability to connect with your assurance audit process. The auditors in Ontario have to be retained by the PRO to sign off on management's reports. And the simpler it is for the auditor to move along the audit trail and review the transaction set, the easier that audit process is, and the more confidence the auditor has that the organization has its act together from a management and transaction handling standpoint. It leads to timely regulatory reporting to the extent that we have periodic reporting mandate to the regulator throughout the course of the year. It's a very simple process. We have daily visibility into all the service provider activities happening in the field, and we're conscious of the trajectory that we have throughout the course of the year towards meeting our annual producer's obligation to collect and recover. And the bottom line is that it gives us the ability to conduct our business with no surprises, which is really what the doctor ordered. Next slide. I think that's it.
Excellent. Maury, thank you so much. We have a few questions that have come in already, and I want to encourage anyone else who has questions to go ahead and send them in now. And next, I'd like to introduce Blake Bennett, Operations and Policy Analyst at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, which is a PSI member agency and also represented on our board of directors. Blake has significant experience overseeing Oregon's stewardship programs for paint and electronics, and he's going to share the government regulator perspective on the role data plays in ensuring program compliance, and also talk a bit about the trends in the types of EPR data sought. Blake, take it away.
Thank you, Amanda. As Amanda mentioned, I work for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, overseeing the electronics and paint EPR programs, and we'll be presenting a government perspective on EPR and data. Next slide. One commonality amongst all EPR programs is a fundamental desire to ensure the materials collected by the programs are managed responsibly, which requires systems set up to ensure their proper management. This can partially occur through good records and records management, including storing and managing of those records, the knowledge that pros are using digital systems like Diversys or similar systems can provide government agencies with greater confidence in the management of those records. Yet records management is not enough to ensure properly environmentally responsible management. There also needs to be good auditing and verification practices performed by the pros, and that the outcomes of those audits and inspections are reported to government agencies. Quality records management helps to ensure confidence for government agencies in those audits. In other words, to ensure environmentally responsible management, it's extremely important that systems are in place to be confident in how much of the material there is and where exactly that material is going. Next slide. Some ways that data is currently being reported by pros to government agencies is through quarterly and annual reporting. This can occur through total amounts collected, which could be either aggregated or shared by collection site, or it can also be reported by amounts or percentages processed by various methods. Again, this can be total, or it might be provided as information by the first level of processor. After the first level, oftentimes agencies are shared where the final disposition is, but not necessarily the quantities or amounts. And other reporting that can also be provided to agencies at times is quantities sold. So for example, with the Oregon e-cycles program, we know the amount of electronic devices that are sold into the state during the previous calendar year. And we also know the amount of material that's collected in that same year by collection sites, both total and individually. And we also know the amount of material that is processed both totally and by the first level of processors. In comparison, for the Oregon paint program, we know information about the total amount collected and by collection site, but instead of knowing the total amount processed by various processors, we only know the percentages processed that went through elements like paint versus paint, paint to product, or landfilling. We do not necessarily know how much material was handled by individual processors. Next slide. In the near future, as society continues to become more data-driven and big data becomes more prevalent, I foresee additional reporting requirements. Areas in which reporting are likely to be more important are greater precision for each material or component, so knowing how much of a specific part of like an electronic device is actually being recycled and where those materials are going. And then again, those amounts or percentages that are processing through the entire process. So not just necessarily the first processor, but how much is going to each processor in the management chain. Next slide. Why do I see these as important? One driver is greater accountability. We have all seen some of the recent images about how plastics are being managed in Southeast Asia. And so as society becomes more aware of how things that they thought were being recycled may not be necessarily managed in the way they thought they were, that's going to drive a system that requires greater accountability. Precision and additional information about the whole process is going to be necessary to provide that accountability. Another driver is for helping in analysis of environmental and well-being impacts and benefits. Next slide. As the concepts like materials management, product stewardship, circular economy, and sustainability become ever more important and commonplace, our ability as a society to achieve those visions will require more accurate analyses. Some examples of current analyses being conducted are environmental footprints, life cycle assessments, and other indicators for well-being. Currently, the standard for those practices utilizes industry averages, but to truly achieve sustainable objectives will require data that is more accurate and precise to specific pathways, transportation distances, and then exactly which processes are managing materials. To be able to differentiate between the best sort of practices, that should be conducted by pros. For example, we might find that a longer transportation distance to a particular processing facility may actually be more environmentally beneficial because the overall process is more beneficial than the nearby facility. So this more complex and detailed analysis will require more precise information for us to know exactly which one of those pathways is the greatest and most important. And thank you again, Amanda.
Thank you, Blake. I will encourage anyone who has questions to keep sending them in. We already have some great questions, some for you, Blake, some of my own, definitely on the way. Before we move on to our final speaker, I want to ask another poll question. In this ever-changing landscape of EPR, what are your biggest concerns? So some of these options here are not understanding my obligations as a PRO, as another stakeholder within the process, differences between jurisdictions, harmonization is one of the big things PSI works on here, fraud prevention, PR, public relations, cost of operations, reliability of data, or something else. And we're getting some responses in. About half of our attendees have participated at this point. And I think that's about everyone who wants to participate. I'll give folks a couple more. All righty. Great. So it looks like about a third of the folks on the call think the cost of operations is their primary concern. Reliability of data, a little bit more than a third. And then cross-jurisdictional differences come in next. So I think those would probably rank in my top three as well. And Mark, I'd like to introduce you because I think you can address some of this with your presentation. Mark is the Chief Product Officer at Diversys, which is a PSI partner company that seeks to power a world without waste through their software solution, which collects infield data, conducts back office functions, and helps with analyzing and reporting program data. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Amanda. Next slide, please, Jess. So we're going to be talking about two things today. One is just the concept of data-driven organizations. It's somewhat serendipitous that the results of the poll earlier, I think that was the #1 item, and sort of the evolution towards being a data-driven organization. And then next, we're going to talk about Diversys, the company I work for, and how we can really help you on your journey to embrace your data. Next slide, please. So, we would previously talk about the evolution of and the interaction of people, process, and technology in terms of how teams would operate or in terms of how companies would operate. And really, it was at the intersection of those three. However, that's now changing as people start to think more about data. And data literacy is really defined as the ability to read, write, and communicate data in the context and leveraging that data towards achieving your business or your organizational or your team outcomes. And the concept of data literacy is really at the intersection of all of the components of what used to be sort of the people, process, and technology pyramid. And it's changing the manner in which we all work as organizations become more data-driven. So let's talk about what being data-driven and what data-driven organizations look like. Next slide, please. So you can think of this picture as a data-driven maturity model. And these can really apply, this model can really apply both to your organization and to you personally as you progress through your career. And you're going to be asked another poll in a few minutes about sort of where you sit on this spectrum. So I kind of want to talk in a little more detail about what each of these stages of the data-driven maturity model means. Next slide, please. So I'm a Lego geek, so I like to think about Lego, and this is kind of the simple way to think about it, is at the far end of the spectrum of data resistance. It's like a box of Lego dropped on the floor randomly. And then at the far end, of course, you have sort of increasing levels of organization of that Lego or of that data. So let's talk about specifically the first stage, and let's drill into now what does data resistance or a data resistant organization look like? Next slide, please. So this is an actual capture from an oil steward with their identifying information blanked out, of course. But the data capture here is slow, it's manual, it's error prone, it's not real time, it's not centralized, it doesn't scale. And if you're here, you really need to think about your data maturity. And very often, if you're here, this can be overcome with a champion in a particular domain of your organization. Next slide, please. So moving up one stage from data resistant is data curious. And in this particular case, it's more about the inadvertent discovery of the data. And so you weren't really looking or being prescriptive about it, but you saw something, oh, that was interesting. So that's kind of data curious. One step up from that is the data aware organization. And you're starting to become a little bit more prescriptive here. And you're starting to think about, as you look at your data, what should I keep doing? What is the data telling me to keep doing? And what is the data telling me to stop doing? One of the challenges at this middle stage is you have all of these tool silos. You have organizational silos. They all have their own tools. And very often you have what's on the next slide, which is kind of spreadsheet hell, where you have this data and these spreadsheets spread across different business units. So people are trying to do analysis of the data, but it's really hard to do any sort of strategic analysis or decision making. Next slide, please. So next up is data savvy. So here you're starting to ask even more interesting or challenging questions, such as why. So you might ask, why did sales dip this quarter, or why did we sell or produce more of product X versus product Y? And finally, at your last stage, you're being very data driven. And what's happening here is, I talked earlier about you're doing your retrospective. You're looking at what should I keep doing and what should I stop doing. But you're asking the much more interesting and harder question, which is what should I start doing? So what's the data telling me to look at that's next? What's next? And in this case, in this final state, data is driving all strategic decisions you're making in your organization. Next slide, please. And you might have some data analysis or dashboards that look something like this, with real-time data available at your fingertips, bubbling up across business units with the right KPIs, and you can make both tactical and strategic data-driven decisions. I think we have another poll next. And so here I'm asking you, which category best describes your organization's current relationship with data? So starting at the left end of the spectrum from data resistant all the way up to data driven. I actually can't see the results of the poll. So Amanda, I think you're going to have to tell me if people voting and what the votes are, because I can't see the votes as they're coming in as a panelist.
Yeah, sure. We have responses from about 50% of the participants so far. I encourage you to keep sending them in. So far, a lot of people are saying they're data aware, 43%. The next highest is data curious. And then after that, we have about 18% data savvy and 16% data driven. So that aligns with where I felt we'd be. Most people are in that data aware stage, a lot of spreadsheets and not a lot of ease.
Yeah, so that's I can see, I saw the results there just quickly at the end, so that's great. Yeah, that's pretty common. Very happy to see not many people at the data resistance stage, and certainly more of a distribution of the other four. So next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about how Diversys can help you improve your organization's data maturity. Maury would have touched on this earlier, but just in a little more detail, we at Diversys provide a software solution for the circular economy that provides real-time workflow management and accurate data capture, and we improve the overall performance of your recycling initiatives. Next slide, please. And so think about this like the before state, and maybe some of your current realities, but there's very labor intensive data capture. Maybe the data that's captured is not real time, and perhaps oftentimes it's incomplete. And it can be difficult to do data analysis and or the required compliance reporting that was talked about earlier. Next slide, please. And so with Diversys, and call it the after state, we've got easy and fast data capture. It's real time, it's accurate, and you're moving to digital transformation, and you're moving towards the right end of the spectrum to be a data-driven organization. Next slide, please. So really three components here to our solution. There's the in-field data capture by your in-field participants. There's real-time visibility for all the administrators or stewards of your program. And then there's dashboards and reports for various forms of analysis in real time. You know, we track products from waste right through the transformation into their derived products. That transformation can be important to some organizations. There's a strong focus on data accuracy, and one of the benefits there is it eliminates both sort of inadvertent and or fraudulent errors. And we purposely built the Diversys platform from the ground up to be waste and recovery stream agnostic. So it handles multiple waste streams: tires, used oil, organics, electronics, etc. I want to give just a quick view of, next slide, please, Jess. A quick view of what the product looks like, because I know many people like videos or pictures of that. So I've got a recorded demo that Jess is going to kick up here in a second. And it gives you a view of data capture in the circular economy. And so we're going to start with an infield capture from the hauler. So he or she is on his mobile device. They log in, they go to a particular location, they do a pickup, and they see they see the list of transaction. In this case, they're going to do a pickup. They're going to scan the QR code, which is the location that they're picking up on the wall, so we know exactly where they are. They'll enter in the number of units. I might take a photo of the manifest in this particular case as well. I need this signed off, and so there's a signature required. And then that hauler is done. Simple as that, to capture a lot of data with a minimum amount of input. Flipping over to the administrator side now. So we're going to have the admin who's logged in. We see a dashboard where they can track progress. And immediately I can see and drill into that transaction that was done by that driver. I actually see a whole bunch more data. In this particular case, I see a distance deviation that says There's a difference between where the QR code was located and the GPS location, so I probably want to look into that. And of course, I can see all of the details of that transaction, plus much more than what they entered in real time. So that's just a quick view of the app. Of course, there's more details. Happy to have conversations with various people afterwards if they like. Here's sort of another example from one of our customers. So Maury talked about tires. Here's an oil waste stream. In this particular case, they're responsible for oil antifreeze filters and the containers that go with those. Before Diversys, it was paper form heavy. There was incomplete and very manual data entry. And next slide, please, Jess. You know, after they implemented our solution, there was immediate and accurate data collection. It's simplified reporting. They can track their commitments in real time, and it also significantly speeded up payments. And that's another side benefit of our solution. When you talk about being data-driven, there's a number of aspects of the ROI. In this particular case, we see a year one, just a first year ROI of over 600%. There's a range of benefits here. Some of them are labor related, some are data accuracy, some are payment efficiency, but they all factor in the value of moving up the food chain to be much more data driven. Next slide, please. You know, in conclusion, and as we saw in the poll, you know, all organizations are on this journey or on a spectrum of moving towards a data-driven model. I'm quite excited to be part of Diversys, who are bringing data to the forefront in the waste and recycling space. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That was really fascinating. Lots of questions popped up during your presentation for me. And we have a number of questions here from our audience too. We're going to move into the Q&A period. So if you have questions that you haven't asked yet, please feel free to type them into the Q&A field. I want to start with one that I think is a really good one. This was asked during Maury's presentation. Someone would like us to walk through a particular example with a specific material to understand how the data about that material or that group of materials is captured in the system. So this person used aluminum beverage cans, but of course, Maury, you handle tires and you handle various special products, and maybe you could use one of those as an example.
Sure. Thanks for the question. And it's a good question because, and convenient for me because I've done some work in different jurisdiction helping understand how we could use a Diversys implementation in a glass bottle collection and recycling application. Ultimately, you know, Diversys works with the fundamentals of any collection or recovery stream. There has to be collection sites. There have to be people who pick up that material and move it from point A to B. And then, you know, point B being the processor has to, you know, account for what amount of material came in and what went out. In the case of an aluminum beverage can, presumably, you know, the user of that aluminum beverage can will hopefully drop it into a recycling bin somewhere out there. Could be a municipally operated collection bin, or it could be a private collection bin. But in either event, that would constitute a collection site. From there, there will be a company or a firm or a person or somebody who collects the material from that collection site. And in order to track that that act has occurred, they're not just picking up one beverage can, they're picking up a receptacle holding a bunch of beverage cans. So in that instance, a person could scan a QR code on the receptacle or on the wall or on somewhere conveniently located for them to scan it, that would denote that they are there about to enter a transaction, and they can just register that they picked it up. And then the collector, the hauler could continue and do that multiple times throughout the course of the day and have 50 pickups done by the time the day is done. And they're going to go to a place to drop it off. In this example, let's say they drop it off at a processor. Well, at that point, they're going to scan the fact that they've arrived at a processor. So the device registers the QR code and reconciles the GPS coordinates at the same time, by the way, and drops off its load. In most of these situations, because people are being paid by the kilo or ton or something like that, there will be an act of measuring the weight of this material. The simplest way to do it is have the vehicle drive over a scale on the way in and drive over a scale on the way out. The difference will be the amount of material that was dropped off. And in the Diversys application, it's a simple matter to just take a picture of the scale ticket that's issued and attach it to the transaction that was created in the act of dropping off the material. And there you've completed the process flow to the processor. And then the processor now has possession of X amount of kilograms of material and can do a similar type of transaction entering. When they can finish converting it, they can say, we have now created this much material or sold this much material, and enter a transaction that denotes that. So there the dots are all connected, from one can being dropped into a receptacle to being accumulated for pickup. Multiple receptacles the contents are being transported, dropped off, weighed, and then the producer can account for how much they've converted into some sort of derived material. And all of those transactions can be stood up and reviewed and audited. Hope that answers your question.
I think so. I'm just going to encourage our speakers to share their video now that we're in the Q&A portion of the screen. And I have a quick follow-up question for you, Maury, but perhaps it's also for Mark. If as Blake has been intimating, there's an increasing desire to find out what then happens to those materials after they get to the processor and where they go from there. Is Diversys equipped to be able to then, track data about where it's being sent in some way, data that the processor enters, or where it's sold and gone to?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So the short answer is yes. I didn't have time to put it in a 90-second video, but there's a concept of derived products as well. And so you can capture what was collected and then capture what that turned into in terms of derived product. And I saw a follow-on question in terms of, some products might be disposed of, sadly, or partially might be disposed of. And so, yes, we would be able to track both the output of derived product and those that were disposed of.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So, one of the things that struck me during the presentations was, and there's a question here about, why the provinces wouldn't just use one association or one PRO. And, there are a whole lot of reasons, concerns about monopolistic pricing and other things, but the trend is really towards competition among PROs. Here in the United States, we've had single PROs for products here for our EPR programs, but we see that changing in pharmaceuticals, and as packaging is implemented here, we anticipate that will change. So having a system as a PRO where you can really track the data that you need to be competitive, whether it's understanding how to charge your producers, or how, with eco-modulated fees, where are the big costs and where do you want to disincentivize use of a product, whereas where are, the benefits and the markets, and, where do you want to incentivize a certain material is going to be really important. And then, of course, you've mentioned the compliance portion, making sure you're meeting your goals. You don't want any surprises But of course, adopting software is really hard. And I'm wondering what the biggest obstacle was for you, Maury, in adopting this, or to Diversys, to Mark, what have you found is the biggest obstacle that customers say they haven't adopted USIFR? Like, why take the plunge?
Well, I'll take the first part of that question, and really, I don't think there was much of an obstacle to overcome because I was committed to using a system and being an early adopter of this system to make sure that we were able to achieve our stated goals of meeting our producer's obligation. To some extent, we have the usual obstacles of user adoption, and that you know, there's a certain amount of tech aversity for some users who are not generally working in a role that required them to have any devices or do any transaction tracking. So those are the kind of obstacles that are not too tough to overcome. And it's certainly enhanced when you can demonstrate to them that the actual transaction tracking is pretty fast, and they don't need to have a high level of skills to do what they're doing. So.
I'm happy to add a little bit onto that as well. I like quotes, and one of my favorite ones is from a pioneering computer scientist called Grace Hopper, who said one of the most dangerous, I might misquote her slightly, but one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language is "because we've always done it that way." And so, you know, we see that a bit. There's, as Maury said, we're just used to doing it this way. We've always done it that way. And so it takes and can be overcome either by a leader in the organization who says, no, there's got to be a better way to do it. So top down. And sometimes I've seen bottom up, where a person in a particular silo finds a solution and becomes a champion for that and sort of sells that upwards. So I've seen both of those work, but that's typically the biggest obstacle is we've always done it that way.
Sort of a similar related question that we might address while we're on this topic. Somebody has asked, you know, even in an overall data savvy organization, there are staff that are, you know, at different levels of data awareness. Some might be more data curious, others more data aware. And are there any sort of training or capacity growth opportunities that you've seen in the industry to help with software adoption at, you know, your own organization or at your clients' organizations?
I've seen a couple. I mean, a couple of ways to solve that problem. It's a great question. One is, so if you have these silos, then you want to be sort of cross-pollinating messaging on, if you have someone who's super data savvy or data driven, give presentations to those maybe less data driven folks, either across organization or not, just to show them what can come from the data. Another one is just having the organization, if there's someone high up who believes strong enough in it, then, you know, in whether you have weekly or daily stand-ups or whether you have quarterly business updates, but take the time to leverage data and have that become a central part of the conversation of the company. And the third one is various webinars. I know Gartner, for example, has got a bunch of really good ones on sort of the evolution of data and data-driven organizations.
Excellent, thanks very much. So this is a question, I think, for all of you, including Blake, because you might know this answer. Are there any programs right now that are verifying end markets or final destination of collected products and materials? And how might the audit process for that work? You know, there might be multiple brokers involved. Is that something, Maury, you've thought through, or Blake, you've encountered?
I have some thoughts on the topic, so I'll kick it off, and hopefully it'll provide segues for my colleagues on this call too. But you know, this kind of opens the question as to when is recycling or recovery complete? Like, define the finish line here. And I think this question is sort of saying, well, okay, what's happening after the finish line, and how do we measure or manage that, where this is going, or at least have knowledge about it? In our regulatory framework and in the system that we have stood up there, the finish line for collection and recovery is when the outputs of processing are sold at a positive economic value to a firm that is going to use them as a substitute for virgin material in most cases. And that's a desirable outcome. And I think to a large extent, it's mission accomplished or recycling, subject, of course, to recovery rates. I mean, if you are recycling something that's capable of generating 95% recovery, but you're only achieving 5%, then there obviously you want to be able to measure those results over time to signify improvement in recovery rates. But the next part of that question, which is what's happening to it from there, well, it really depends on the material you're talking about. One of the most recycled materials in the world is steel. And there are as a healthy amount of broker and agent activity in that market. And from the standpoint of just trying to know when you've hit the finish line, when a transaction is registered by a processor that they've sold this material rather than give it away for landfill or something like that, that they've sold it to somebody who's going to use it to refine further or include in their product, then for us, that's sort of all we need to know that we've accomplished recovery. I can understand in other product instances, you'd want more visibility into what happened to it from there, because you want to make sure that undesirable outcomes aren't occurring. And in that case, how you set up a system, irrespective of the software, to manage, these transactions, there's a lot of considerations there, including confidentiality, because not everybody wants their transactions to be, communicated, without having a degree of control over who knows what. You need to implement a system to track where it's being sold as best as possible if there's sensitivities around it. Steel is not a case where there's a lot of sensitivities around where it ends up, because if it's being sold to someone paying money for it, they're going to use it in their product. If it's being given away, you might want to wonder what's happening to it. I hope maybe that answers some of the question there.
Well, certainly in the case of paint, you're looking for as much of it as possible to be recycled back into paint, but there are end uses, alternative daily cover being one of them. So you'd want to be able to track how much is where, and those programs to encourage highest and best use as part of the policy. So seeing the dispensation and where it's gone is important. And Blake, you've talked about how there's an increasing desire, especially around plastics and electronics. And Maury, I should think even with maybe tires and some of the special products you deal with, there's an increasing interest in understanding how it's actually managed and where it's actually going. And I'm wondering if you have any additional thoughts, Blake, around that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways in which it might be shared with government agencies on sort of the final location. So it could be shared up front in the program plan. If it's not there, we're usually shared at some point in the annual reports. Maybe it's an appendix or a confidential element. But we do know the intended final destinations. The emphasis on intended is we don't necessarily know if that particular processor was used, because there might be several processors in the list. So for example, with electronics, we might know that the circuit boards are shredded, but then there might be a list of, say, 3 smelters that could be used by that processor as they send it downstream. So we know the process broadly is they'll shred it and then send it for smelting, but we may not receive information on how much or what percentage went to which of the smelters. Similarly for other programs like, say, the paint, it's possible we could deduce the amounts that go somewhere. So if, say, for the alternative daily land cover, there's only like one site that accepts that material, then we would know based on the percentage how much sort of the material that they are presenting. So there's a couple of ways it can be deduced and or known. but it doesn't necessarily a definitive.
And do you know, Blake, to the first part of that question, if there are any programs right now tracking the end market to which the materials are going as part of the policy?
Yeah, so for the Oregon E-Cycles program, we have what's called an environmental management practice guidelines. So all of our programs have to sort of follow these general guidelines, which says that they are following these guidelines through every step of the process. So that means they need to make sure that whatever, for the pros, need to make sure whatever processor they hire knows that that processor needs to make sure that throughout the chain, that any vendors they're using are also following those guidelines. And then there's the responsibility to audit the processors to make sure that process is sort of being followed. So yes, we do know where the material is going, and there are to some extent verifications and assurances that the material is being managed correctly throughout that chain, as long as those auditing practices are being followed the way in which they're stated, and those practices do describe well enough the chain of sort of command and how that's being verified.
Thanks. I'm gonna circle back around to the first question we asked about tracing materials and the data about those materials as they go through the system. We have a question here that asks in the example, in a different example, how might a driver record accurately a pickup of amounts of a product in like a tote box of paint? Is it, number of cans? Is it the volume of the paint? They can all be very variable. Is it mostly weight? How is the Diversys product set up to do it? And how might, Blake, you're a paint expert, how might that actually be trackable?
So I'll talk about what we can do in Diversys, which is, so it's completely configurable. In the paint space, it would typically be volume, but we can capture cans or gallons or bins or containers if you'd like. Another sort of related example that I can take from one of our customers in the electronic space is they're just picking up these big drums or bins of random electronics. And so they have a sampling process where they're required to sample, I believe it's something like 10% of what they pick up. And then someone's got to go through painstakingly and categorize those into one of a couple hundred categories of what exactly that electronic was. And then they do that sampling every week and every month. And then that 10% is extrapolated over the course of what they picked up. All of that sampling information can also be captured in our solution.
So the sampling information can be captured, which I think even in the case of paint, to this person's point, you could pick up a tote of gallons of paint, but there might be one that's half full and one that's quarter full and one that's completely empty, and except for dried paint. So Blake, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, so from my understanding of the way some of the programs operate, like the paint, they do share in our annual reports their process for estimating it. And they have reported in the past about doing exactly like Mark shared, that they do sampling to try to come up with like a typical amount that you might see for a tote that shows up. And part of the way that we get that sort of like collection level information is that they're having to like each tote or gaylord or whatever the material is being transported in has sort of a sticker that says the location. And so the processor site is generally weighing that tote, and then Paint Care or somebody else is making the calculation to convert the weight of that tote with the cans in there based on sampling to sort of what the anticipated volume is for that particular collection site. And similarly for electronics, actually we as the state of Oregon we set up a sampling protocol and then ask our stewardship organizations to go out and conduct that sampling so that we have a general idea of sort of the percentage of different device types that are coming through the program as well. It's sort of a verification step, but in the E-Cycles program, I think the programs also count each the processors already know the individual device that's going over their conveyor belt. That information may not necessarily be reported to the state, though.
So I don't know if Diversys has been implemented in any packaging programs, or Mark, if you can answer this, but we have another materials question here along the same vein around, if you're picking up multi-materials, say commingled recyclables, how does that get captured in the data in a system like Diversys?
So it's I go back to that same example on electronics, which is it really is a bunch of commingled electronics, and you go with the sampling program. That's the way I've seen that done. There may be other methods where there's sort of automated sorting / calculations post pickup, and we can actually do adjustments post pickup, so there can be estimates of volumes or weights or units when they first get picked up, and those can get then readjusted in a mid stage if that's also a process that some recovery streams would follow.
Great. There's also a question here around, how one would track environmental data. Blake, in your presentation, you had talked about some of the sorts of information related to life cycle analysis and other components of the environmental sustainability of a system like this. Diversys may not be set up to track that yet, but it's coming down the pike. And is it something you've talked about, Mark, within Diversys about bringing environmental data into the picture? Or Blake, is that something you see government agencies heading towards?
Yeah, so within our program, we have an LCA specialist who actually does some of these calculations. But again, a lot of the information that they have to utilize is industry averages. But if there's something that's known more detailed about the process, so maybe the transporter uses an electric truck versus like a diesel truck, and then how far that truck is going, the more of that data that can be captured or known, the more that can be inserted into the analysis and become more accurate. Similarly, if we know that like a printed circuit board is shredded, and then where it's sent, we'll know where it's transported, and we'll know maybe the specific smelter. So if the pros then work with the smelter to understand their process, we can go from an average, industry average for a smelting process to like very specific detailed about that smelter's like capturing methods for particulate matter, waste and energy conversions and those sort of things. So the more we know exactly how much of a particular amount of a circuit board went to which smelter and what that smelter is doing and the process, the transportation that it went there, we can get more detailed in those sort of analyses. Right now, I don't necessarily think that detail isn't necessarily being provided, which is why we sort of rely on industry averages. But I think there's a lot of room for that to sort of be created as people sort of begin to think more creatively about these systems. So, one thing that pops into mind is perhaps processors may move to like Oregon only processing days. So they know exactly the material that they processed that day and what like material or Gaylord or what they put it in prior to transport. And then that could be scanned and moved further down the system for additional tracking purposes.
The other thing that I've seen in the environmental space is wanting to determine how much of a particular resource stream, once it gets, or if it's getting diverted out of a landfill, then what are the greenhouse gas implications of not putting it in the landfill? So I see that sort of coming in fairly short order as well.
So this gets to another question someone had asked, was this thinking through this done pre-legislation, during rulemaking and regulation making? And I'm not sure during whose presentation this was, but where I thought it was during your presentation. It begs the question, the Diversys software has been built around EPR legislation that exists now and meeting the requirements of EPR programs now. And we know this at PSI from evaluating programs, we learn a lot once a law is implemented about what works and what doesn't and how we can improve upon it. And then you go back and you tweak it, or you create a new model, and new laws are a little bit more robust and have some more more reporting requirements, or maybe we want to capture different data. I've heard you say that Diversys system is adaptable. You know, can you talk a little bit to how you as a software company are looking at the legislation and designing to it versus designing ahead of it?
Sure.
Maybe?
Yeah. No, great question, Amanda. You know, the simple answer is there's a spectrum of EPR legislations across, well, the individual states and provinces, and then geographies and countries throughout the world, right? So there isn't a single piece of legislation for a particular resource stream that's consistent. There's obviously commonalities between many of them, but they're not 100% consistent. So we're looking at the lens of all of those. At the same time, there's a camp of folks who want to get out and solve these problems and or become more data driven in advance of EPR legislation. So it's not just EPR that's driving our product roadmap and our decision about what we build. It's the combination of how we can help organizations for sure meet and exceed their EPR needs, but at the same time, we're also trying to help businesses who are trying to solve these problems and become more data driven and add value from a data perspective. Some of it's for EPR, some of it is just to be more efficient as an organization. And so it's both of those things that are driving us. And we're always kind of looking at both categories to decide what we're building next.
And just a quick follow-up, we have a question about a couple of questions actually. One is this solution, is the Diversys solution one that could be used in, say, Europe or other jurisdictions, Latin America, where there are programs, EPR programs with, you know, they're all different models. I've heard you say you're product agnostic. Is it configurable enough to work in multiple jurisdictions?
It is, yeah. So there's nothing inherent in it that is specific to Canada, the United States, and it's a SaaS-based solution, so you know it can run anywhere on the planet.
Someone also asked, is there a certain sort of size threshold for an enterprise that would make it worthwhile to use Diversys? Can smaller enterprises use it, or is there a way to use it through an org?
Yep, yeah. So there's our business model is based on the number of sort of registered users in the system. So if you have a low number of users, then we scale up from low up to high. So there isn't necessarily a minimum. There might be a practical minimum. You know, if you were a couple of people, well, in total for the whole program, including transporters and processors and collectors, well, okay, that probably doesn't make sense. But we scale nicely from low to high, and that's another reason why. And another way to answer your adoption question as well is around, you can pilot it in a subset of your company or of your, call it stewardship, for the folks who might be more willing to take on technology, see how that goes, and then you can roll it out to a larger audience.
Thanks very much. I have a question here. That was, it's a very broad question about the ways in which, say, Oregon's programs or regulations, the policy, right, and the software are each contributing to an improved resource reuse sector. Like, is reuse in any way built in, or can it be configured within the system?
Sure, I'll feel part of that. Speaking with specific reference to the Ontario situation, reuse is a outcome that, for lack of a better word, hits the scorecard of a producer's recovery results. So in both electronics and in tires, if you can demonstrate that product has been reused, so tires can be collected and resold for another life on a different vehicle, or electronics can be refurbished and used again. If it's a phone system or audiovisual equipment, it can be reused. And in Ontario, there's incentive to make that happen because it's less expensive than collecting and recovering and chewing it up and turning it into something else, and it counts for the same kilograms of obligation that you're looking to achieve. So the regulations are the underpinning of increasing the amount of reuse because there's economic incentive for producers and the PROs who act on their behalf to see that reuse happens because it's less expensive to get it done that way. And with connecting the dots over to Diversys, the transactions that lead to reuse or refurbishment can be tracked in the system in exactly the same way as transactions that lead to the shredding of tires or breakdown of electronics.
Blake, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'd say it's complicated in sort of the way in which the language of the law might be a little bit written. So some laws are very specifically focused on that the material has to the intention is for the material to be recycled. And depending on elements of the law that are structured in there, it could disincentivize reuse. But in other laws, like in the paint law, we have specific mentioning of the waste hierarchy, where reuse is sort of the top and preferred. And the paint program does have reuse sites, knowing that that is both environmentally preferable and also higher up in the waste hierarchy. So I think the paint program for Oregon has about 6% of the amount of material that's collected that goes back into reuse. But what I say, it comes down to the nuances. It kind of depends. So like in the electronics law, there's a collection obligation. And so when you have a collection obligation, which is not so much this case for the paint program, you can have an incentive where we have to recycle because the law says we have to collect so much to recycle. And that could be pushed against reuse if reuse wasn't sort of added in as a terminology. So it really just comes down to the nuances of the framing of the particular legislation.
And to pick up on that, actually, Blake, and it's sort of something I referred to, I think, in my presentation. If you think of this material as waste and the job of these programs to divert waste, then you're actually sort of limiting the effectiveness of the programs. If you think of these materials as a resource and the mandate is to recover the resource, then it widens the net for what is a desirable result and creates the ability to let economic incentives achieve what is looking to happen here. In Ontario, as an example, and look, the Ontario regulations, I'd say they're good. They're far from perfect, but when we went from the Waste Diversion Act to the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act, many things that weren't measured or tracked under waste diversion now become highlighted and achievable, because refurbishment is not waste diversion. Refurbishment is resource recovery. And the logic of our regulations have that mechanism being placed in the foundation of the regulations. And so it can achieve higher reuse because there's economic incentives to make it happen. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that reuse is being worked into models, EPR models, stewardship models more and more. I know that here at PSI, we've worked reuse into our packaging model, and it's been part of the paint program for many years. So
I'd probably, if I could briefly, Amanda, also add to that, of course, the Oregon program, we favor all the aspects, and sometimes there's the forgetting about prevention. And so that's where I think some of this movement towards expansion of the concept around eco-modulation and really being sort of like holistic on the whole life cycle of the product can kind of play into the way that it's managed. But again, it all comes down to sort of exactly, who maybe was the sponsor for the legislation and who was sort of involved in the exact drafting and language of it. So ideals and actualities may not always match up.
Right. Reuse is at the top of the recovery scale, but if you can prevent the material from being used in the first place and reduce it at the source, even better. We have a question here. Recycling and recovery rates in EPR programs are often based on what is collected and recycled and how much is sold into the market. And for programs, and many of those programs are covering exclusively the residential sector. So in programs that do set those requirements or those goals based on the residential sector, how do you count and track accurately what's getting covered when you know that truck routes will often include also business recyclables as well as residential and multifamily units? Is this something that's addressed in program design, Maury, and in the software? Can it be captured? Blake, is this something you grapple with in the policymaking side?
Well, I'll take a crack at this one. First off, there is segmentation in these markets for both sales and supply, as well as collection and recovery. And clearly we would see an example of that in residential versus what we call ICI, industrial, commercial, institutional. And the products and the sort of material handling and logistics, around those products sometimes make it difficult to have one program that works in both segments. Packaging is a case in point. The packaging that comes in over or through a residential system is very different than the packaging that exists in an industrial or commercial or institutional instance. I think that the ability to have a robust system that validly tracks results and measures improvement over time has to be designed from a legislative standpoint with awareness of what's happening in the market for these products, and also awareness that the programs that you create for them may have to jump across boundaries. And it's really hard to be specific about this because the products are so different. In case of electronics, speaking here, that electronics are just a commodity irrespective of what segment they fall into, whereas packaging is sometimes treated differently. It is possible to measure these results across these segments and know that you're never going to get it perfect. There's going to be some cross pollination of these programs where materials can be counted on one side or the other, or and hopefully not both, and there's no double counting. But there's so much more improvement that can happen in here. I would take this as a point where we have to make sure that the perfect isn't the enemy of the good, and that there's so much room for improvement if we just get good regulations out there that are implemented through good programs and focus on the improvement that can happen for collection and recovery rates that are generally very low in a lot of jurisdictions or products. Then you can make good improvements, and over time see how you can refine it.
Anything to add, Blake or Mark, there about how you distinguish the source?
I'm not sure I'd add a lot to Maury's answer. It was a pretty robust answer. I'd say it's very much, agree, it's very much sort of like local dependent, and it's important to know how the system is operating in your area at sort of the time of legislation. And then, and maybe the law, even knowing how it operates, still may not allow it to be captured that well. So that's maybe during that process, or maybe during the regulatory timeframe, also be considerate about, well, how could we get around it? So could we do a waste audit at the trucks en route as opposed to the waste audit at the dump site? Maybe that might be sufficient to provide the detailed information that's necessary. So it's again, just kind of knowing the system and being thoughtful about where in the system could we get more specific about the data that's being provided.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add quickly is, so in terms of data pickups, the platform can be very specific about where it's picking up from, and is that a residence or is that a business? But in the larger context, I've seen pilot programs where they're gathering data and they'll purposely go out and just pick a bunch of businesses. And gather some data over the course of weeks or months just to normalize, okay, here's all of the business data, here's the total data. Now I know what the split is. So I've seen that, at least to get some data into the system globally, or for a particular area of work.
Great. We have 3 questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all, but I'm going to try to touch on each of them and follow up as needed after the webinar. The first is a question about whether this is a system that can be applied across the global logistical chains, from manufacturer put on the market to sellers to third-party retailers, etc. I believe, Mark, if you could just confirm, this is really about the end of life management. Diversys deals with the tail end part of the system, right?
Yeah, it's the tail end part of the system. We can integrate with those other systems that are higher up in the food chain in terms of the manufacturing process.
So there are integrations for that, and I think there are also integrations for various other software programs, accounting programs, and
accounting, right? ERP, CRM, all that type of thing. Yes, exactly.
Gotcha. The other question is about deployment. In terms of deployment, how much does Diversys handle, and how much needs to be handled on site? What does deployment look like for a kind of managed service provider?
So in terms of the software, we handle all of deployment because it's deployed in the cloud. There's an onboarding process that we would follow, and if we're talking to a service provider who's doing that on our behalf, then we would show them how to do that. But there's the obvious discovery that would be part of that onboarding process that the service provider can do.
Great. The last question is a little outside of the context of the webinar, but someone is asking for advice on how to talk to legislators and regulators to get them to allow cannabis producers to manage their waste in a similar producer responsibility fashion, which is going to be increasingly important. But I do want to move on because we are nearing the end of our webinar. I want to thank you all for your amazing questions and comments. Especially I want to thank Maury Schneer, Blake Bennett, and Mark Chemensky. Your presentations were excellent, and the answers to your questions were even better. I learned a lot on the webinar, and I'm happy to have participated with you. I want to remind you all that PSI's webinars and web symposiums are recorded, so you can catch anything you missed. The recording of today's webinar will be posted to the website within 24 hours. Just visit productstewardship.us, click events, and then on-demand webinars, as you see here. If you enjoyed this webinar, you will definitely want to join us for our next one. Maine and Oregon, the New Frontiers of Packaging EPR, which takes place next Wednesday, October 27th, from 12:30 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You'll hear from PSI's members and consummate EPR experts from Maine Department of Environmental Protection and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality about each state's groundbreaking packaging EPR law. Don't miss the opportunity to learn about these programs right from the source. You can register today on our website. As soon as the webinar ends, you're going to see a webinar evaluation form appear in your browser, and I would like to encourage you to please take a moment to provide us your feedback. Your opinion matters. That helps us develop webinars that you want to come and listen to. Once again, a huge thank you to our panelists and to all of you for your participation today. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.